The knives had barely been cleaned when the doubt crept in. The senators who drove their blades into Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC, had rehearsed the crowd's reaction 1,000 times in their heads. Cheering, gratitude, the sweet exhale of a republic reborn. What they got instead was silence. By nightfall, the liberators, as they called themselves, had barricaded themselves inside their homes, listening to the city breathe without knowing whether it was breathing for them or against them. The torches flickered, the shadows stretched, and somewhere beneath the celebration they had imagined, a cold realization settled into their chests like a blade of its own. They had not freed Rome. They had cracked open something ancient and hungry, and now it was loose in the dark with them. The miscalculation that would cost them everything had nothing to do with the crowd. It had nothing to do with Mark Antony's fury or the legions massing at the edges of the empire. The error was quieter than that. Across the Adriatic Sea, in the city of Apollonia, sat a boy of 18, thin, frequently ill, with a name that no one in that room of killers had thought twice about. Gaius Octavius, a footnote, a teenager, a problem they assumed the chaos would dissolve on its own. They could not have been more wrong about anything in their lives, because Octavius was not processing grief the way a boy should. He was not afraid. He was not retreating. He was calculating. And what he was calculating was not how to survive. It was how to make certain that every man who had stood over his adopted father's body would one day beg for a mercy he had already decided not to give. What follows is not the familiar story of Caesar's death. That story ends on the Senate floor. This one is just beginning. This is a 14-year pursuit, methodical, ruthless, and surgical, that reached across continents and decades to find every last man who had been in that room. A campaign built not on rage, but on patience, not on armies alone, but on law, propaganda, and the weaponized memory of a murdered god. This is the story of how the most underestimated young man in Roman history turned a funeral into a throne and hunted an entire generation of Rome's elite to extinction. Before we get into it, drop a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. Subscribe and support the project. You're watching Romanus, your home of Roman Empire, on YouTube. The river Lavino ran cold and indifferent in November of 43 BC. It had no interest in the weight of what was about to happen on the small, unremarkable island sitting in its current near the city of Bononia. 2 legions of infantry stood on the northern bank, boots deep in the frozen mud. 3 legions held the southern side. Not a single sword was drawn. Not a single command was shouted. They stood in total silence, watching the water, because their only job that day was to make sure the 3 men crossing the narrow wooden bridges stayed alive long enough to sit down at a table together. Mark Antony came from one direction, Lepidus from another, and from the third bridge walked Gaius Octavius, 18 years old, slight of frame, with the kind of face that invited underestimation. Before any of them reached the table, they were searched. Hands ran beneath cloaks, pressing against ribs, checking for iron. Every man in that negotiation had watched Julius Caesar bleed out on the floor of the theater of Pompey. None of them were interested in recreating the scene. They sat down not as allies, but as co-conspirators, bound together not by loyalty or ideology, but by the cold arithmetic of survival. The Roman Republic was already dead. They had not come to mourn it. They had come to divide the body. 3 days. No philosophers were consulted. No speeches about the soul of Rome were delivered. They spoke the only language that had ever truly governed the ancient world, the language of who controls the legions and who pays them. The immediate problem was stark. Brutus and Cassius, the architects of Caesar's assassination, had consolidated power in the east and were building an army. To destroy them, the triumvirate needed 43 legions in the field. To field 43 legions, they needed gold. And the Roman treasury was empty. You cannot march men to their deaths on promises. You pay them in silver, or you wake up one morning to find their swords pointed at your throat instead of the enemy's. Octavian studied the ledger. The numbers offered only one path forward. The aristocrats of Rome were sitting on generational wealth: estates, silver, artwork, livestock, ships. The tax system was too slow. Too many clerks, too many collectors, too many delays. Octavian proposed something far simpler, far more brutal. They would not collect from the elite. They would eliminate them and absorb everything they owned. He was not proposing a policy. He was proposing a liquidation. They reached back into the darkest chapter of Roman political history and pulled out a weapon that had lain dormant since the days of the dictator Sulla: the proscriptions, a legal mechanism so elegant in its horror that it barely needed enforcement, because it enforced itself. The concept was simple. A name on the list meant the man was no longer a citizen. He was property, and whoever delivered his severed head to the forum would be paid handsomely for the transaction. On that island, with the river rushing beneath them and legions watching from both banks, 3 of the most powerful men in the world sat with wax tablets and iron styluses and began drafting the death warrants of Rome's elite. The atmosphere was not electric with malice. That is what made it so terrifying. It was calm. It was methodical. It had the quiet efficiency of an accounting session. Lepidus, without hesitation, offered the name of his own brother: Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Antony matched him, writing down his uncle, Lucius Julius Caesar. Octavian, not to be outdone in this theater of performed detachment, inscribed the name of Tyrannus, the very man who had served as his personal guardian in childhood. They were not killing their relatives out of hatred. They were doing it as proof of commitment, as collateral. You can trust me in this pact, because I have already given you my brother's life. The murder of family members was the handshake that sealed the deal. They stripped away every pretense of Roman virtue, honor, piety, blood loyalty, and replaced it with a business model built entirely on murder. When the triumvirate rode back into Rome, there were no trumpets, no processions, no warning. Tribunes moved to the city gates before dawn. Centurions locked down every bridge across the Tiber. The city was sealed before most of its residents had opened their eyes. The senators, the knights, the merchants, none of them knew they were already inside a trap. Then the soldiers came to the Roman Forum, and they nailed white wooden boards, the alba, to the rostra. The boards contained 130 names. Hours later, a second set of boards appeared. 150 more. A crowd gathered. They read the edict, and it was here that the triumvirs revealed the true genius of their operation. They had not merely ordered their soldiers to hunt the men on the list. They had outsourced the slaughter to the entire city of Rome. The edict was precise. Any free citizen who killed a proscribed man and delivered his head to the forum would receive 25,000 Attic drachmae, enough gold to buy a villa, a staff of slaves, and a comfortable life for a decade. If a slave killed his master and brought the head, he would receive 10,000 drachmae, immediate emancipation, and full Roman citizenship. And if anyone was caught feeding a fugitive, hiding him, or simply pointing him toward an unlocked gate, that person's name would be added to the next list. In the space of a single afternoon, the entire social architecture of Rome collapsed. Not slowly, not through erosion. It collapsed like a building whose foundation has been pulled out from beneath it all at once. Trust, the invisible thread that holds civilization together, was severed in every direction simultaneously. The Roman home, the domus, had always been a sanctuary of private power. Its outer walls were high and windowless, designed to project impenetrability. But the threat did not come from the street. It had already been living inside the house for years. Senators sat in their courtyards and looked at the men who had poured their wine every evening for 2 decades. They watched the slave who shaved their face each morning. They saw the calculation happening behind those eyes. A razor, a short walk, freedom and land and gold and a new life. All of it, just one quick motion away. Men who had commanded armies and swayed the Senate floor disguised themselves in rags and wrapped their faces in the cloth of beggars. They crawled through alleyways that their sandals had never touched. It rarely saved them. The streets were flooded with hunters, criminals, discharged soldiers, desperate freemen, opportunists of every variety, all of them with drawn swords and the scent of silver in their nostrils. They kicked in doors. They dragged men from beneath floorboards. The city began to smell of burning cedar and drying blood, and the two smells became inseparable from each other in the Roman memory. The stories that filtered through the streets in those weeks were not the stories of Rome's glory. They were something else. A man named Salassus heard soldiers breach his front doors and ran for the roof. He looked down into his own atrium and saw his household slaves, men he had owned, fed, and clothed, pointing upward, directing the soldiers toward the stairs. He calculated the options in a fraction of a second. He threw himself from the roof onto the paving stones below. He chose the ground over their hands. The senator Thoranius, the same man whose name Octavian had written on the island, hid in a villa outside the city walls, sheltered by a friend who had risked everything to give him a bed. He might have survived. But his son, a military tribune, discovered his location. The son was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was simply a man looking at an inheritance that would be confiscated by the state the moment his father was killed by a bounty hunter. So he led the soldiers to the door himself. When the centurion broke through the wood and the old man looked up from his chair, Thoranius asked for one thing. He asked the soldier to spare his boy and ensure he received the property. The centurion looked at him and told him, slowly and without cruelty, that it had been his boy who had given them the address. The old man's face collapsed. The sword fell before the grief finished crossing his expression. Women bolted their doors from the inside and locked their husbands out on the street, shouting through the wood that they had never seen the man before in their lives, protecting the dowries they knew would be stripped if they were found harboring a fugitive. Brothers disappeared into the night and were found 2 days later, poisoned, by brothers who had done the math and decided that half an inheritance was better than nothing. Men climbed down into the Cloaca Maxima, the enormous, ancient sewer system that ran beneath the city like a second Rome, and lay in the filth and the dark, breathing through cloth, listening to the boots above them on the stone. Some survived the stench and the dark for days. They were dragged out by the hair anyway, blinking in the sudden light, and executed on the spot in the mud. The forum itself was transformed. Desks were placed at the base of the rostra. Clerks sat with open ledgers and quill in hand, tallying the transactions. Bounty hunters walked up the steps in a steady line, canvas sacks dripping dark fluid across the white marble. They reached into the bags, lifted the heads by the hair, and set them on the desks, Clerks cross-referenced faces against the lists, verified the identities, and handed over the silver. The heads were then spiked and mounted for display. The pile accumulated until the stench of decay became a permanent feature of the Roman political center, a constant reminder to every senator who walked past, every merchant who crossed the forum, every citizen who came to watch the proceedings unfold. Octavian moved through it all like a man reviewing accounts. His face revealed nothing, no satisfaction, no revulsion, just the cold, administrative presence of a man checking whether the work was being done correctly. But there was one name on the list that stood apart from all the others. One man whose death was not about money or legions or the balance of a treasury. One death that was personal. Marcus Tullius Cicero was not simply a senator or a political operator. He was the voice of the Roman Republic itself, its greatest orator, its most formidable legal mind, the man whose words had shaped Roman law and Roman identity for a generation. And he had spent the preceding months using that voice as a weapon. From the Senate floor, Cicero had delivered the Philippics, 14 speeches of sustained surgical destruction aimed directly at Mark Antony. He had called Antony a drunk, a tyrant, a degenerate who had disgraced every office he had ever held. He had done it publicly, repeatedly, and with the confidence of a man who believed that institutions would protect him. He had also made a catastrophic miscalculation regarding Octavian. He had written, privately, that the teenage heir of Caesar could be praised, honored, and discarded, a useful tool to be wielded and then thrown aside once the real politicians had stabilized the Republic. The phrase would outlive him. Octavian had read it. Octavian remembered everything. When Cicero heard his name spoken aloud in the context of the lists, he was at his villa in Tusculum. The man who had built his entire life on the power of reason and composure discovered, in that moment, that kinetic violence has a particular effect on the philosophically prepared mind. It erases the philosophy instantly. He panicked. He ordered his slaves to carry him to the coast in a litter, swaying through the late autumn countryside with no clear destination and a mind that could not stop calculating. They reached his estate at Astura. He boarded a small vessel and told the captain to sail for Macedonia, where Brutus still held territory. The winter sea responded with indifference. The water was violent and cold, throwing the small boat relentlessly. Cicero, the man who had written with eloquence about the acceptance of fate, vomited over the side and ordered the captain to turn back. He came ashore at Formiae, trembling, exhausted, and broken by the gap between his ideas and the body that carried them. He sat in his coastal villa and stared at the wall. Ancient historians recorded what happened next with the kind of detail that suggested they found it significant. A flock of ravens descended on the building, an enormous number of them, clattering against the shutters, landing on the windowsills, moving through the corridors until one flew directly into the room where Cicero sat and knocked the writing stylus from his hand. His slaves were terrified. They begged him to move. They told him the birds were a message. Cicero did not argue. He let them lift him back into the covered litter and carry him toward the woods, toward the shore, toward one last attempt at survival. The soldiers were faster. 2 men led the detachment, Herennius, a centurion, and a military tribune named Popilius, a name Cicero would have recognized immediately, because years before, Popilius had stood in a Roman courtroom accused of parricide, the murder of his own father, the most contaminated crime in Roman moral law. Cicero had defended him, had argued for his innocence, had saved him from execution. Now, Popilius was in the woods with a drawn sword and orders to collect the head of the man who had once saved his life. A freedman named Philologus, a man Cicero had personally educated, lifted from nothing, treated with genuine paternal affection, pointed the soldiers toward the tree line, toward the direction of the litter and the crashing of branches. The soldiers ran. Herennius shouted for them to stop. Inside the litter, Cicero heard the heavy boots on the dead leaves and understood with complete clarity that there was nowhere left to go. He did not instruct his slaves to run. He did not attempt to bribe the soldiers. He told them to set the litter down on the path. The curtains opened. Cicero looked up at the men standing over him. He looked ruined. His hair had not been dressed in days. His face was coated in road dust and carved deep with exhaustion. He looked at Herennius with the calm of a man who has finally stopped fighting the inevitable and feels, unexpectedly, the relief of it. He did not ask for his life. He said only this: "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but try to kill me properly." He leaned forward out of the litter and extended his neck over the edge. Herennius brought the sword down with full force, the head separated cleanly. But Antony's instructions had been explicit. The head alone was not enough. He wanted the hands that had written the Philippics, that had held the quill that called him a drunk and a monster in front of the assembled Senate of Rome. Herennius swung again. The right hand came away, then the left. The soldiers wrapped the pieces in cloth and rode hard for the city. They arrived in the forum while Antony was seated at the tribunal, presiding over a civil dispute. When Herennius placed the head and the two severed hands on the table in front of him, Antony's composure broke. He laughed, not the polished laugh of a man performing for a crowd, but the raw, ugly laugh of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a specific kind of relief. He paid Herennius 10 times the standard bounty. Before the display was mounted, the remains were brought to Antony's home. His wife, Fulvia, had been waiting. She had her own account to settle with the dead orator, her own memory of being mocked, dismissed, diminished by the voice that had commanded Rome for decades. She sat in her atrium and received the head. She placed it in her lap and looked at the face for a long time. Then she reached up into her own hair and drew out a long golden hairpin. She pried open the rigid jaw. She pulled the tongue out of the dead mouth, and she drove the pin through it, slowly, deliberately. It was not rage. It was a statement, a precise, considered punctuation mark placed at the end of a chapter. The head and the hands were nailed to the rostra, the same platform from which Cicero had spoken for 30 years. Romans walked through the forum and looked up at what remained of their greatest voice. No one needed to be told what the message was. The republic of words and laws and Senate decrees was finished. What stood in its place had no interest in eloquence. It only understood one grammar, and that grammar was written in iron and settled with blood. The killing continued until the lists were empty. Hundreds of senators erased. Thousands of knights stripped of everything: their property, their status, their names, their bloodlines. The terror did not end because anyone felt mercy. It ended because the work was complete. The ledger balanced. The treasury was full. The 43 legions were paid and loyal and ready to march. The machinery had served its purpose and was allowed, finally, to go quiet. The triumvirs stood in the capital they had turned into a charnel house and looked east. The trap in Italy was closed and sealed and stacked with bodies. But the operation was only halfway finished. The men who had started all of this, The senators with their daggers, the idealists who thought they were saving the Republic, were still alive across the Adriatic, massing legions on the plains of Greece, telling themselves that justice was still possible. Octavian turned his face toward the sea. He had purchased the largest army in the Roman world with the lives of its own elite class. Now it was time to spend it. The assassins had spent 14 months convincing themselves that the teenager across the water was manageable. They were about to discover what he had been building toward all along, and they were about to discover it in the worst possible way, with no road left to run down and no name left uncollected from the list he had been carrying since the Ides of March. The gold of the Republic had already been spent on promises no one could keep. Brutus and Cassius understood this with the particular clarity of men who had made an enormous gamble and were now watching the odds shift against them in real time. They had fled Rome with their lives, their reputations, and very little else. They needed an army. They needed grain, silver, and the loyalty of men who would march into battle for them. And so they sailed east, to the ancient wealthy provinces of Asia Minor and Syria, and arrived not as the liberators they believed themselves to be, but as something far older and far uglier. Conquerors with a cause they were still trying to believe in. They descended on the eastern cities like a debt collector who has run out of patience. The mission was simple and brutal. Extract everything. Silver from the temple treasuries, grain from the provincial warehouses, fighting men from every city and village and crossroads town that owed Rome its allegiance. They were building a war chest from the bones of the civilization they claimed to be saving. The city of Xanthus, in the rugged coastal region of Lycia, refused. The Xanthians looked at the Roman legions surrounding their walls, calculated the mathematics of their situation, and closed their gates anyway. There is a particular kind of courage in that decision, or perhaps a particular kind of despair. Brutus ordered the siege without hesitation. His engineers moved the machines into position. The Xanthians fought from the walls with everything they had. When the Roman battering rams finally opened the first breach in the timber gates, when the legionaries poured through with drawn swords, and the outcome became inevitable. The citizens of Xanthus chose the fire. They did not surrender. They set their own homes alight. The flames moved through the streets with terrible efficiency, consuming the houses, the market stalls, the granaries, the shrines. Brutus stood outside the burning perimeter and listened to it. The screaming, the collapse of burning timber, the specific, horrible sound of a city destroying itself from the inside out. He watched mothers carry their infants to the edge of the flames and step in. He saw men draw knives across their wives' throats, choosing that over the alternative. The slave markets, the labor camps, the Roman auction blocks. He offered his soldiers a bounty for every living Xanthian they could drag from the inferno. The final count was 150 survivors from an entire city. Brutus walked through the ruins afterward. The ash was still warm beneath his sandals. The smell of charred bone is a specific smell, sweet and ancient and wrong in a way that no philosophy can prepare a man for. He had killed Julius Caesar to save the Republic from tyranny. He had written letters about virtue and civic duty and the moral obligation of the honorable man to act against despotism. He had held that story about himself with both hands, like a lamp in a dark corridor. Standing in Xanthus, looking at what was left of the people who had simply chosen not to pay him, he felt the lamp flicker. The story began to come apart. He was not a liberator. He was a man with legions and a treasurer. And when a city refused him, he burned it. Whatever he had been in Rome, Whatever he had imagined himself to be in the Senate House with a blade in his hand, that man was somewhere back across the Adriatic, buried under the ash of the Ides of March. What remained was this: a general in the ruins of a city that had preferred death to submission. His mind began to rot from the inside, quietly and without announcement. Further south, Cassius was operating without any of Brutus's philosophical complications. He marched into Rhodes with the directness of a man who has never once confused himself for a hero. The Rhodians possessed the finest naval fleet in the eastern Mediterranean, fast, disciplined, and crewed by some of the most experienced sailors alive. Cassius demanded the fleet and the treasury. When the Rhodian leadership hesitated long enough to constitute resistance, he killed them. He stripped the island of its gold, its silver, its ships, and whatever remained of its dignity, and moved on. Cassius never suffered from the moral vertigo that was slowly dismantling Brutus from within. He was a pragmatist in the most complete sense, a man who understood that the only question that mattered was whether his neck would still be attached to his body in 6 months, and that the answer depended entirely on how well he paid his legions. He plundered a dozen cities without losing a night's sleep, and used the proceeds to buy the loyalty of every soldier who would take the coin. They reunited at Sardis, 100,000 infantry between them, 20,000 cavalry, the largest Republican army ever assembled. They pitched their camps outside the city walls and sat down to look at each other across the command table. And what they saw was not encouraging. Brutus was fraying. The weight of Xanthus, the insomnia, the guilt that had begun to express itself in ways he could not always control. It was visible on his face, in the way he held his body, in the speed with which his composure dissolved under pressure. He accused Cassius of corruption, of enriching himself and his officers at the expense of the Republican cause. Cassius fired back with the contempt of a practical man for an idealist, mocking Brutus's principles as the luxury of someone who had never had to actually run an army. They shouted at each other inside a command tent until their voices gave out. Then they embraced, as men who have no one else do, and pretended the cracks were not there. The cracks were there, and it was at Sardis, on a night when the camp was quiet and the guards stood at their posts and the oil lamps burned low, that the ghosts arrived to begin collecting. Brutus did not sleep. He had not slept properly in months. He spent his nights the way men in psychological collapse spend their nights, moving compulsively between activity and paralysis, reading philosophy he could no longer absorb, reviewing logistical reports he already knew by heart. On this particular night, the lamp on his folding table began to dim. Not because the oil was running low, not because of a breeze. It simply dimmed, as if something in the air had changed. Brutus looked up from his scroll. A figure was standing in the entrance of the tent. The ancient sources are specific about this detail. It was not the size of a man. It was larger. It held itself differently. It occupied the space between the tent flap and the interior in a way that made the familiar space feel wrong. Brutus did not call for the guards. He did not draw a weapon. He was, at his core, a Stoic, and a Stoic confronts what stands before him. He asked, "Who are you? Are you a god or a man?" The entity answered. The voice, as the historians recorded it, was hollow, not empty, but hollow in the way a well is hollow, with something beneath the surface that does not echo back. It said, "I am your evil genius, Brutus. You shall see me at Philippi." Brutus held his voice level. He said, "I shall see you." The figure disappeared. The lamp burned bright again. Brutus walked to the entrance of his tent and asked the sentries if anyone had passed. They looked at him with the careful expressions of soldiers who do not want to tell their general that they think he is losing his mind. They had seen nothing, heard nothing. He went back inside. He did not sleep. The guilt had moved past the point where he could manage it through reason. It had taken on a shape and a voice and made appointments. He had driven iron into Julius Caesar, his patron and his friend, and the debt had come to present itself in the dark, in a tent in Sardis, wearing a face that belonged to no living man. The liberator was broken. The question now was only how long the army would take to discover it. They broke camp and marched into Macedonia. Moving a force of that size is not a military operation in the conventional sense. It is the migration of a small city through hostile terrain. The logistical requirements were staggering. Hundreds of tons of grain consumed every single day, just to prevent the men from becoming too weak to hold their weapons. They stripped the Thracian countryside of everything that could be carried or eaten. They burned the villages that had hidden their winter stores. The local tribes were too wise to meet them in open battle. They moved through the tree line alongside the Roman columns, launching arrows into the flanks and slitting the throats of stragglers at night. The Republican army advanced along the Via Egnatia, the great Roman road that stitched the Adriatic coast to the eastern provinces, and left a trail of graves behind them that no one marked and no one came back to tend. They stopped near the town of Philippi. The position was, from a purely defensive standpoint, almost perfect. The terrain funneled any approaching army into a narrow plain. The northern border was a wall of craggy, impassable mountains. The southern border was a malarial marsh that swallowed men and machinery alike. Brutus anchored his position on the northern high ground. Cassius dug his camp into the hillside nearest the swamp. They constructed a fortified wall connecting both positions and reinforced the perimeter with trenches and sharpened timber palisades. They had the elevation. They had a functional supply line. They had a Republican fleet controlling the sea at their backs. The strategic logic was clear, and they both understood it. Wait. Let Octavian and Antony come to them. Let the autumn turn to winter. Let the supply lines stretch until they snap. Starvation would do what the legions didn't have to. The marsh disagreed with this plan immediately. It was a breeding environment of almost supernatural productivity. For disease. Mosquitoes descended on the camps in clouds dense enough to block the light. Dysentery moved through the ranks like a secondary army, pulling men out of formation and depositing them in the latrine trenches, bleeding and delirious. The ground was permanently saturated. Iron armor began to rust at the hinges. Leather straps swelled and rotted. Men slept on damp earth and woke with fevers they could not shake. The stench of the latrines blended with the stench of the marsh until the entire encampment existed inside a single, unbroken smell that clung to clothing and skin and did not wash out. Before the enemy had even arrived, the environment had begun its own systematic campaign against Republican morale. Antony arrived first. He did not wait for Octavian, who was somewhere behind the column, moving slowly, suffering through an illness that had reduced him to a litter carried by 4 soldiers. Antony was constitutionally incapable of waiting for anything. He marched his legions to the edge of the battlefield, looked at the Republican fortifications on the high ground, assessed the tactical disadvantage with the eye of an experienced soldier, and pitched his camp on the flat ground directly opposite Cassius. He wanted to provoke a fight, not because he thought it was strategically optimal, but because Antony was a man who resolved tension by moving toward it. Octavian arrived days later, carried into camp on that wooden litter, his body running a fever his mind refused to accommodate. He could not walk. He could barely sit upright. But he understood the arithmetic of the situation with complete clarity, even through the illness. They could not survive a long campaign. The Republican fleet had already intercepted a triumvirate convoy on the Adriatic. 2 legions of reinforcements, armored men who had gone to the bottom of the sea still wearing their chainmail, dragged down by the weight of the very equipment designed to protect them. Those who had clung to wreckage had been finished off with flaming arrows. The resupply route was closed. The backup was gone. The army that Antony and Octavian had assembled, purchased with the blood of Rome's elite, built in the slaughterhouse of the Forum, was now isolated in a foreign country, with autumn turning to winter and no one coming to save it. If they could not force a battle, they would starve in the mud. Antony solved the problem the way he solved most problems, with aggression and engineering conducted in the dark. He had noticed that the southern marsh, for all its horror, was not entirely impassable. The tall reed beds concealed strips of solid ground. His engineers went in at night, cutting through vegetation, sinking timber and stone into the mud in the dark, building a secret causeway deep into the swamp, a route that, if completed, would place triumvirate forces directly behind Cassius's position and cut his supply line to the sea. Cassius's scouts spotted the movement before it was finished. He responded immediately with a counter-wall, driving timber palisades through the marsh at an angle designed to bisect Antony's causeway and render it useless. The 2 engineering projects met in the mud and turned into a skirmish, and the skirmish turned into something Antony, characteristically, refused to keep proportional. He lost his temper. He looked at Cassius's men working in the marsh, tearing apart the causeway he had built in the dark, and he pointed his sword at the Republican fortifications and ordered a full frontal assault. No tactical formation, no measured advance. A direct charge against the wall, fueled by fury and the particular kind of violence that follows frustration. His legionaries moved with terrifying speed. They hit the timber palisades like a hammer hitting a door. Grappling hooks flew over the top. Men ripped the wood apart with their bare hands when the hooks weren't fast enough. They scrambled over the wreckage with swords drawn and fell on the Republican defenders before they could organize a response. The panic that spread through Cassius's camp was instant and total. The formation collapsed. Men ran. Antony's infantry flooded through the breached wall and into the camp, burning tents, cutting down men in their sleeping quarters, seizing the fortification from the inside. But the plain of Philippi is wide, and the dust thrown up by the movement of hundreds of thousands of boots had created a fog so thick that neither side could see more than 50 meters in any direction. While Antony was tearing through Cassius's position on the southern flank, an entirely separate battle was erupting in the north, one that no one on either side had ordered. Brutus's legions, watching the triumvirate forces moving in the valley below, did not wait for the signal. They charged down the hillside on their own initiative, crashing into Octavian's legions with the full weight of the high ground behind them. The impact broke Octavian's forward lines immediately. The Republican infantry drove through the triumvirate formation like a wedge, pushing the survivors back toward the camp perimeter. They breached the outer defenses. They stormed through the command area. They found the wooden litter, Octavian's litter, the one that had carried him into camp, and drove their swords through the mattress again and again, certain they were killing the heir of Caesar before the campaign had truly begun. They were stabbing empty linen. Octavian's physician had warned him. Hours before the assault, he had pulled the general from the tent and moved him somewhere the soldiers would not think to look. Octavian was in the bog, lying in the mud of the marsh that had been destroying both armies from the inside. Shivering, feverish. listening to the sound of his own camp being dismantled around him. He survived the first Battle of Philippi not through strategy or courage or the intervention of Roman gods, but because a doctor told him to leave the tent, and he listened. The first Battle of Philippi was not a battle in any classical sense. It was two simultaneous collisions happening inside a dust cloud, each side invisible to the other, producing a result that made no clean sense. Antony captured Cassius's camp. Brutus captured Octavian's camp. The armies had literally passed through each other in the fog, slaughtering rear guards, burning supply wagons, destroying each other's infrastructure, and emerged on the far side having won and lost simultaneously. No one had a clear victory. No one had a clear defeat. They withdrew to their original lines and tried to count their dead. Cassius retreated to a ridge overlooking the plain. He stood in the settling dust and tried to understand what had happened. His eyesight had always been poor. He squinted through the brown haze at the movements below and could not resolve the banners. He saw a large body of cavalry riding toward his position and could not determine whose they were. He turned to his senior officer and told him to ride down and find out. The officer, Titinius, kicked his horse and descended the ridge. Cassius watched him approach the cavalry, watched the riders surround him, watched them pull him from the saddle, then heard the unified shout that rose from the group. Cassius made his conclusion. The cavalry was Antony's. Titinius had been captured. Brutus was dead or broken. The battle was finished. The Republic was over. One wrong inference, drawn from insufficient information through failing eyesight in the settling dust of a battle that had just been won on the northern flank, and the mastermind of the Ides of March surrendered to despair. The cavalry was Brutus's men. They had ridden to find Cassius specifically to tell him about the victory in the north. They had surrounded Titinius to embrace him, to pull him from the saddle in celebration, not capture. The shout was a cheer, a roar of triumph, not the war cry of men taking a prisoner. Cassius did not know this. He walked away from the ridge. He entered an empty tent. He removed his armor piece by piece. He called for his freedman, a man named Pindarus, and handed him a specific blade, not a random sword. The exact dagger he had driven into Julius Caesar's ribs on the floor of the Senate, on the Ides of March, in 44 BC. He told Pindarus to use it. The freedman drove the iron into his master's neck. Cassius bled out on the dirt floor of a tent in Macedonia. Killed by a misunderstanding, the blade of the assassination turned back on the assassin himself, doing its final work. Minutes later, Titinius came back up the ridge with a crown of laurels, the symbol of victory, intending to deliver the good news. He walked into the tent. He found what was on the floor. The irony completed itself in the silence. Titinius drew his own sword and fell upon it, dying beside the man he had come to save. When Brutus received the news, he wept. He called Cassius the last of the Romans, a title that said more than he intended, because it acknowledged, without quite admitting it, that whatever was left of the Roman Republic now rested entirely on Brutus alone. And Brutus, looking at the army around him, the fractured morale, the supply problems, the ghost that had visited him in Sardis, the ruins of Xanthus still visible somewhere in the back of his memory, knew exactly what that meant. 3 weeks passed. Both sides sat behind their fortifications and stared across the plain at each other. Antony and Octavian began throwing leaflets over the walls, written promises of amnesty, of gold, of a fresh start for any man who crossed the line before the next battle was called. Republican soldiers began disappearing from the camps at night, slipping through the dark in ones and twos, making their calculations. Brutus responded by throwing silver coins at the feet of his officers during councils of war, a gesture that was simultaneously desperate and revealing, because it made visible the fact that he was no longer commanding through authority or belief, but through bribery. The noble cause had become a payroll problem. The liberators had become mercenaries who could be bought by either side, and the only question was who was paying more this week. The men began demanding a second battle. They were tired of the trenches, the rations, the dysentery, the rain. They wanted it finished in either direction. They threatened, collectively and individually, to simply stop following orders if Brutus did not commit. He tried to hold them. He argued. He explained. He laid out the strategic logic, that waiting was still the rational choice, that winter would eventually do their work for them. They did not care about rational choices. They were cold and sick and afraid and wanted the thing decided. On October 23rd, Brutus gave in. He ordered the formation. The Second Battle of Philippi stripped away everything that military history likes to celebrate. There were no flanking maneuvers, no brilliant cavalry charges designed by a tactician who saw the terrain 3 moves ahead. No deceptions, no traps. The two armies walked toward each other across the open plain and began to push. They threw their javelins at close range. They drew their short swords. They pressed their shields into the shields of the men in front of them and simply pushed with everything their bodies contained until one side stopped pushing back. Men were crushed to death in the compression of the lines before they suffered a single wound, just squeezed from both sides until something inside them failed. The ground became a paste of mud and blood, and the contents of men that had no name in polite language. The screaming was so uniform and so total that individual voices lost meaning, and the whole plain simply roared. Octavian's men fought with the particular fury of men who believe they are avenging something, not just a tactical objective, but a cosmic debt. They hit the Republican shields and kept hitting them, absorbing losses and advancing, the way an army fights when it thinks the gods are watching and keeping score. They found the weak point in the center of Brutus's formation and drove into it with everything available. The Republican line held for a period of time that felt, to the men inside it, like much longer than it actually was. Then it did not hold. The center fractured. Men dropped their shields and turned. First one, then a cluster, then a wave, and the retreat became a rout before the command structure could do anything about it. Antony released the cavalry. They moved around the edges of the collapse and hunted the fleeing infantry across the plain, running them down from behind, cutting through the rear of a broken formation that could not defend itself in any direction. Brutus got out. He rode north with a small group of officers through the chaos, climbing into the rocky hills as the darkness came down. They stopped near a stream. He looked up at the sky, clear, cold, full of stars that had no opinion about what was happening beneath them. He knew the geometry of his situation without anyone having to explain it. The coast was sealed. The mountain passes above him would be sealed by morning. There was no Macedonia to escape to. There was no fleet waiting. There was no Cassius to share the weight with. There was only this, a cold hill in the dark, a handful of men who had followed him further than anyone had a right to expect, and a line from a Greek tragedy that surfaced from somewhere in his memory and refused to leave. He said it aloud. "O wretched valor! You were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real indeed. But now, it seems, you were but fortune's slave." He asked Volumnius to hold his sword. Volumnius refused. He asked Clitus. Clitus refused. These were men who had crossed the Adriatic for him, who had marched through Thrace, who had sat in the mud at Philippi and believed, for months, that this was still a cause worth dying for. They could not bring themselves to kill him. not because they doubted it was the right ending, but because some executions require a distance that friendship makes impossible. He found Strato, a Greek rhetorician who had come along for reasons that probably felt very different at the beginning of the campaign than they did now. He asked Strato to do it. Strato agreed. He turned his face away, gripped the hilt of the blade, and braced the pommel against the earth. Brutus did not hesitate. He stood up, fixed the point, and drove his chest into it. The iron went through him cleanly. He fell onto the rocks beside the stream. The last breath of the Republic came out of his lungs without drama, without ceremony, without a Senate to record it. Just a man on a hillside in the dark, and then silence. Octavian's soldiers found him at dawn. They cut off his head, the head of the last of the Romans, the last man to have believed, however catastrophically, that the Republic could be saved through the murder of the man who was ending it, and sent it back across the Adriatic to Rome, to be placed at the feet of the statue of Julius Caesar. The war in the East was over. The battlefield was closed, but the list had never been only about generals. Dozens of the men who had stood in the theater of Pompey on the Ides of March, the ones with the smaller daggers, the ones who had struck secondary blows, or simply stood nearby and said nothing to stop it, had slipped away in the chaos following Philippi. They boarded small boats. They changed their names. They found distant provinces where Roman authority arrived slowly, and the news traveled on horseback. They told themselves that the storm had passed, that the heir of Caesar was satisfied, that it was enough. The generals were dead. The army was broken. The cause was finished. Surely it was enough. It was not enough. It had never been going to be enough. Octavian had not built a treasury and funded 43 legions and crossed the Adriatic and survived the mud of Philippi and the fever and the empty litter full of sword holes because he wanted the generals. He wanted every man who had been in that room, every man who had made the calculation that Caesar should die, every man who had held a blade or cheered the ones who had. The battlefield was closed. The real hunt was just beginning. The dust over Philippi had not finished settling before the division began. Two men stood over the wreckage of the Roman Republic and looked at each other across the body. And what passed between them was not grief, not triumph, but the cold calculation of men deciding how to split an inheritance. Mark Antony took the East, the wealthiest half of the known world, the ancient perfumed provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, with their accumulated centuries of gold and grain and civilization layered so deep that a Roman general could live off the interest without ever touching the principal. Antony traveled to Athens, then to Ephesus, then to Alexandria, which was not so much a city as a monument to the idea that human ambition had no natural ceiling. He surrounded himself with philosophers and banquets and the company of Cleopatra, who was the kind of woman that rewired a man's sense of proportion. He believed he had won the grand prize. He believed, with the comfortable confidence of a man who has stopped paying attention, that the contest was finished. Octavian took the West. He returned to Italy. And Italy, in 42 BC, was not a prize. It was a problem that had been left to rot for 20 years of civil war. A peninsula with a drained treasury, a ruined infrastructure, a starving population, and tens of thousands of battle-hardened veterans who had been promised farmland that did not yet exist anywhere except in the speeches of men who needed their swords. Octavian was 20 years old. He was chronically ill. His body had been failing him since before Philippi. He had survived a siege on a litter, hiding in a swamp, and now he was standing in front of the full accumulated disaster of the Roman Republic's collapse without Agrippa's fleet or Antony's legions at his immediate disposal, and he had to solve it alone. He did not retreat. He did not negotiate his way toward a comfortable delay. He sat down at his desk and went to work. He understood something about power that most men who want it never learn until it is too late. That empires are not maintained with speeches. They are maintained with ledgers and logistics, and the willingness to make choices that will make everyone hate you in the short term. He wore rough wool while Antony wore purple. He ate plain food while Antony's banquets lasted for days. He audited accounts while Antony debated philosophy with men who had no armies. And to pay the veterans, because veterans without land become a different kind of army, one pointed in the wrong direction. He did the thing that no politician who cared about popularity would ever do. He forcibly evicted the populations of 18 entire Italian cities. Farmers dragged from land their families had worked for generations. The countryside erupted. The riots were real, and the anger was legitimate, and Octavian absorbed all of it without changing course, because he understood that a general without loyal soldiers is not a general. He is a man with a title and a limited lifespan. The unrest found a shape and a leader. Antony's wife, Fulvia, who was not the kind of woman who waited quietly at home while her husband made world historical decisions in distant provinces, raised an army in 41 BC alongside Antony's brother, Lucius. They marched on Octavian directly. They seized Perusia, a fortified hill city in the interior of Italy, and dared him to come for them. Octavian came for them. He did not arrive with terms or negotiations or the offer of a dignified exit. He arrived with legions and engineers and an intention to end this in the most unambiguous way available. He ordered a trench dug around the entire perimeter of the city, then a wooden palisade with watchtowers. Then he sealed every road in. Perusia became an island surrounded by Roman steel, and Octavian did what he was becoming famous for doing in situations of this kind. He waited. Winter settled over the hill country. Inside the walls, the food ran out quickly, more quickly than the defenders had planned for, because sieges always outlast the optimistic projections of the people being besieged. The citizens ate the horses. When the horses were gone, they ate the dogs. When there were no dogs, they boiled the leather from their own shields and ate that, because the human body in extremis will chew anything that was once alive in the hope that something nutritional survived the process. The defenders loaded insults onto lead sling bullets and launched them at Octavian's positions. Archaeologists have recovered these projectiles, and the inscriptions on them are remarkable in their creativity and their desperation, targeting Octavian's physical weakness, his chronic illness, the body that had always seemed inadequate to the ambitions it contained. Octavian did not answer. He sent no messengers. He offered no negotiations. He simply held the trench line and let the mathematics of starvation do what legions would have done with more noise and less certainty. Perusia surrendered in the spring of 40 BC. Fulvia escaped. Lucius Antonius was pardoned. Octavian was not yet ready for a direct confrontation with Antony, and killing his brother would have triggered one. The lower-ranking soldiers were processed and released, but the local magistrates and the senators who had aligned themselves with the rebellion, who had given it legitimacy and infrastructure and a legal framework, those men were separated from the general population. Octavian waited for the specific date he wanted. March 15th arrived, the Ides of March. 3 years after Caesar's blood had dried on the Senate floor, Octavian ordered a pagan altar erected in the center of the military camp, consecrated to the divine spirit of his adopted father. 300 men were brought to the altar. Their throats were cut. Their blood ran over the stone. It was not a battlefield execution. It was a ritual, calculated, deliberate, and timed for maximum psychological effect. Because Octavian understood that raw violence has a short memory, but violence staged as ceremony echoes for years, the message reached every corner of Italy without needing to be translated. This was not politics. This was not negotiation. This was something older and more total. The boy from across the sea had come home, and he remembered everything. With Italy stabilized, not peaceful, but stabilized, which in this context meant that the violence was now flowing in a controlled direction, Octavian turned toward the Mediterranean. A new problem had been growing while he managed the interior, and it had a name and a fleet, and a stranglehold on the food supply of Rome itself. Sextus Pompey, son of Caesar's old rival, had seized Sicily and turned it into a fortress at sea. He commanded a hybrid force of naval veterans, freed slaves, pirates, and the political refugees of a dozen collapsed causes. Fast, mobile, and completely uninterested in standing still long enough to be hit. He had blockaded the Italian coast. Grain ships sailing from Africa could not reach Ostia. The warehouses in Rome went empty. The bakeries closed. The crowds that had cheered the triumvirate now threw stones at Octavian in the Forum, because hunger is the fastest route from loyalty to fury. Sicily had also become something else, something that mattered to Octavian on a level beyond the strategic. The men who had survived Philippi, the lesser conspirators, the ones who had held smaller blades or stood in the crowd and done nothing to stop what was happening, had followed the currents of desperate men and washed up on Sextus's island. Behind his walls, protected by his fleet, they lived in coastal villas and told themselves that the sea was wide enough to matter, that the new master of Rome would eventually find something more pressing than hunting aging senators who had made a bad decision 14 years ago. Octavian had no navy adequate to the task. More specifically, Octavian had no navy adequate to the task and a body that became violently ill on open water, which is a significant tactical limitation for an admiral. He knew this about himself. He did not allow his ego to overrule the assessment. He handed the command to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a man of identical age, zero aristocratic background, and a mind that approached military problems the way a blacksmith approaches iron, with the understanding that everything yields to sufficient heat, correctly applied. Agrippa looked at Sextus Pompey's fleet, fast pirate ships, experienced crews, intimate knowledge of the Sicilian coastline, and concluded that the Romans could not beat them on the open water playing by the existing rules. So Agrippa changed the rules. He changed the environment itself. He marched tens of thousands of slaves to the Bay of Naples and ordered them to dig a canal through a narrow strip of land, connecting the Tyrrhenian Sea to Lake Lucrinus, a volcanic crater lake sheltered from the ocean by a thin strip of coastline, invisible from the sea. Then a second canal from Lucrinus to the deeper Lake Avernus. He built a naval base inside the crater, Portus Julius, that could not be observed from outside, could not be attacked without first crossing the open water and the coastal fortifications, and could operate in complete concealment. The air over the base smelled of volcanic sulfur. The sound of axes splitting timber and hammers driving iron pegs echoed off the crater walls around the clock. A new fleet assembled in the dark, out of sight of every Pompeian scout vessel in the western Mediterranean. Agrippa did something else. He built 20,000 wooden frames on dry land, the approximate dimensions and rowing positions of a warship bench, and trained his rowers on solid earth, drilling them in synchronization, in timing, in the precise coordination required to accelerate a heavy vessel and hold a course under combat conditions. They trained on stone before they trained on water. By the time they launched, they were not a crew learning to row. They were a machine that happened to be made of human beings. He also invented a weapon. The harpax, a heavy ballista-launched projectile tipped with iron hooks and trailing a thick iron chain. It was not designed to sink ships. It was designed to stop them. When the iron hooks bit into an enemy hull, they could not be cut free with swords. The chain was too thick, the tension too great. A winch on the Roman vessel would simply begin reeling in the chain, dragging the enemy ship alongside, closing the distance until Roman infantry could step across the gap and fight the kind of battle they had been trained for since childhood. Agrippa turned every naval engagement into a land battle by other means. In 36 BC, the fleet launched from Portus Julius. The Battle of Naulochus was not a contest. It was a systematic industrial process. Sextus Pompey's captains watched the harpax projectiles fly and realized too late that the tactical language they had mastered, speed, maneuver, the open water advantage, had been made irrelevant by a device they had never seen before. Ships were caught, anchored in place, boarded, and taken. Others were rammed by the heavier Roman hulls before they could accelerate to escape. The sea around Sicily turned dark. 300 vessels sunk, captured, or consumed by fire. Sextus himself broke through the closing net on a fast galley and ran east, where Antony's officers eventually found him and executed him before he could become someone else's problem. The blockade was broken. The grain ships sailed. Rome ate, and the sanctuary was gone. Octavian's men arrived in Sicily with lists. They moved through the coastal villas methodically, kicking in doors, pulling men from the rooms where they had been waiting out the years. The proscribed survivors of the Ides of March, the ones who had spent years convincing themselves that distance was the same as safety, were collected from the island and executed in the streets. But not all of them. The ones who had moved fastest, who had watched the news from Sicily with the particular alertness of men who had been running long enough to recognize the sound of footsteps. Some of them had already gone east, toward the only remaining protection that existed in the collapsing architecture of the ante-Caesarian world, toward Antony. The alliance between Octavian and Antony had been rotting for years from the inside. Two halves of a temporary arrangement that had served its purpose and now stood in each other's way. The formal rupture came in 31 BC. The two halves of the Roman world met at Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece, and what followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a logistical suffocation. Antony and Cleopatra arrived with hundreds of heavy warships, deep-hulled, bronze-prowed, crewed by experienced men, and a substantial land army positioned on the coast above the Ambracian Gulf. On paper, the force was formidable. In practice, it was trapped inside its own strategic choices. Agrippa moved first and moved fast, cutting the sea lanes before the fleet could establish open water freedom. The supply depots in southern Greece, the chain of ports and warehouses that fed Antony's army, were taken one by one. The exits from the Gulf were sealed by Octavian's lighter vessels, which could not be caught by the heavier Republican ships, but could move fast enough to enforce the blockade. Octavian did not attack. He watched. Summer arrived and thickened into the particular heat that settles over the Greek coast in August, and Antony's position began to eat itself from within. The water inside the Gulf turned brackish as the supply line failed. Malaria moved through the tents along the shoreline with the systematic efficiency of a secondary army that had been waiting for exactly this kind of stagnant encampment. Men lost weight rapidly. First the reserves, then the muscle, then the will to care about tactical positioning. Scurvy took teeth. Dysentery took men who had survived 3 campaigns. Antony's generals began defecting in ones and twos, crossing the lines with information about troop dispositions and fleet strength and the accelerating collapse of morale behind the walls. Octavian received them, extracted what they knew, and waited. When Antony finally forced the breakout, his fleet was already diminished by disease and desertion before the first ram struck water. The engagement that followed was less a naval battle than the violent end of something that had been dying slowly for months. Cleopatra's squadron broke through the thinnest section of the blockade with her personal treasure fleet and drove south toward Egypt. Because Cleopatra was a woman who had survived multiple catastrophic political collapses by always knowing which direction the exit faced. Antony saw her go. He left his flagship. He left his men, who were still fighting on the water and on the shore. He climbed onto a fast galley and followed her. The army he abandoned on the beach watched his sail disappear and then looked at each other and at the forces of Octavian surrounding them on 3 sides, and they made the only rational decision remaining. They surrendered. Antony reached Egypt. He reached Cleopatra. He received the final accounting of everything he had lost. He fell on his sword with the particular clumsiness of a man who had spent his life handling violence and somehow managed to botch the administration of his own death. He survived the wound long enough to be carried to where Cleopatra was holding herself in a fortified mausoleum and died in her arms in a scene that, in other circumstances, might have been described as romantic. Cleopatra outlasted him by days. She allowed an asp to bite her before Octavian could lead her through Rome in chains. She denied him the triumph of displaying her. Even in death, she managed to refuse him something. Octavian walked into the palaces of Alexandria and took inventory. The Ptolemaic treasury was staggering, accumulated over centuries of Greek-Egyptian rule, concentrated in one place, now available to fund the next phase of Roman consolidation. He was 32 years old. He was, without qualification or challenge, the ruler of the known world. Every legion in every province, every treasury in every city, every governor in every territory. All of it flowed toward him and through him and existed by his permission. But he was still carrying the ledger. 2 names remained on a list that had been started on the Ides of March, 14 years and a lifetime ago. The first was Turullius, a senator who had stood in the theater of Pompey with a blade and used it, and who had subsequently demonstrated a survival instinct impressive enough to carry him through Philippi, through the Sicilian purges, through a decade of increasingly narrowing options, and into the inner circle of Antony's operation, where he had made himself useful as an engineer in the desperate years before Actium. Antony had needed ships. Turullius had gone to the island of Kos, looked at the ancient sacred grove of trees dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, tended by priests for generations, the kind of place that exists in every culture, as a reminder that some things are not supposed to be touched, and ordered his men to cut it down. All of it. Every tree. Because ships required timber, and the war required ships, and the theology could wait. After the suicide of Antony, Turullius did what he had been doing for 14 years. He ran. Octavian's men caught him. They always caught them eventually, because Octavian did not stop looking, and brought him to Alexandria. Octavian looked at the man and made a decision that was not about expedience. It was about theater. He did not execute Turullius in Alexandria. He put him in chains and shipped him back to Kos. The soldiers dragged him to the center of the ruined grove, surrounded by the stumps of trees that had been standing for centuries before Turullius decided they were lumber. The local citizens gathered to watch. The sword came down. Octavian presented the execution not as personal revenge, but as piety, the restoration of a sacred space, the satisfaction of the gods who had been offended by the destruction. He was, to the end, a man who understood that the framing of power matters as much as the exercise of it. One name remained. The last one. Cassius Parmensis was a poet, a playwright, a man of letters in a world that had progressively fewer uses for men of letters, and progressively more uses for men with swords. He was also the last living person to have drawn a knife and driven it into the body of Julius Caesar. 14 years. He had been running for 14 years, surviving Philippi when almost no one else did, surviving the Sicilian purges, surviving Actium, surviving the sequential collapse of every protective structure he had managed to build himself into. He had made it to Athens. He had rented a room. He had inserted himself into the rhythms of academic life in a city that had seen enough political exiles to know how to look past them politely. He tried to convince himself that the logic of his survival was sound. Octavian was now the ruler of the Roman world. He had an empire to administer. Gaul, Spain, Egypt, the eastern provinces, the Rhine frontier, the Danube. Surely, the bureaucratic weight of governing everything would crowd out the interest in hunting one aging writer who had made a bad decision in the theater of Pompey a decade and a half ago. Surely, the list had a practical endpoint. Surely he had outlasted the will, even if he could not outrun it. He had spent 14 years studying Octavian. He had somehow still not understood him. In the winter of 30 Thalers BC, Cassius Parmensis stopped sleeping easily. The ancient historian Valerius Maximus preserved the account of his final nights, and what the account describes is the internal architecture of a man whose guilt and fear had been running at full pressure for so long that the boundary between reality and its distortion had begun to fail. He was lying in his bed in the dark when he opened his eyes and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Not a slave, not a visitor, something that occupied the doorframe with a size and a stillness that did not belong to anything living. Dark-skinned, with matted hair and a thick, tangled beard, standing without sound or movement. Cassius asked it what it was. The figure answered in Greek. 2 words, kakodaimon, the evil spirit. He called for his slaves. They came with lamps. The light reached every corner of the room and found nothing. The doors were locked from the inside. His slaves had been in the outer room and had heard nothing move. They looked at their master with the expression of people who have been asked to confirm the existence of something that leaves no evidence. Careful, cautious, trying to give the answer that will calm the situation without committing to a claim about what is real. Cassius ordered them to stay. He lay back down. The lamp burned in the corner. His heart was still going too fast and would not slow. He was not a superstitious man by disposition. He was a writer, an intellectual, a man who had spent his life in the company of ideas. But he had also been running from a consequence for 14 years, and the consequence had been patient enough to wait. And now his sleeping mind was producing the fear in its oldest and most legible form, because there was no other channel left for it to use. He managed to close his eyes. Minutes passed. The room grew cold in a way that had no wind behind it. He opened his eyes. The figure was standing directly over the bed, looking down at him from a height that no doorframe in Athens could have admitted. He did not sleep again that night. He did not have long to wait. Days later, the door came apart. Quintus Valerius was an officer in Octavian's military, and he did not arrive with a document or a writ or anything that resembled a legal process. He walked into the atrium of the rented house in Athens with the specific purposefulness of a man who has been sent to finish a task and intends to finish it. Cassius Parmensis looked at him and at the sword, and understood in that moment the kind of understanding that does not require words, that arrives complete and without the possibility of revision, that the run was over, that the number of mornings remaining had just resolved to 0, that 14 years of survival had delivered him, after everything, to this room in Athens, in front of this man, on this particular day. The sword moved in the light of the Athenian morning. The last architect of the Ides of March hit the floor. The ledger closed. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BC. He held 3 consecutive triumphs, 3 days of processions through the streets of the capital, with wagons carrying the looted wealth of Egypt and the Ptolemaic treasury and the accumulated material of a civilization that had just been absorbed into the Roman engine. The crowds cheered with the fervor of people who have been through enough chaos to feel genuine relief at the appearance of a stable center, regardless of what that center costs in abstract political terms. The Senate bowed. The ceremonial vocabulary of the Republic was preserved, because Octavian was smarter than his adopted father, and one of the lessons he had extracted from Caesar's death was that the symbols matter as much as the substance, that men who feel they have been humiliated will find a knife even if they have to manufacture the occasion themselves. He walked to the temple of Janus, the god of thresholds, of beginnings and endings, of passages between one state and another. The doors of this temple were kept open in times of war. They had been open, without interruption, for 200 years. Octavian placed his hands on the bronze and pushed the doors shut. The sound they made was the sound of an era ending. He did not call himself king. He had watched what happened to the last man who reached too openly for that word. He maintained the Senate. He held the elections. He preserved the forms of the Republic with the care of a man who understands that the form is what the people need, that they do not ultimately care who controls the legions and the provinces and the treasury as long as they can pretend, plausibly enough, that the old system still obtains. In 27 BC, the Senate offered him a title that was new enough to carry no old associations and old enough to carry weight. Augustus, the revered one, the consecrated one, the one set apart by the gods themselves from the ordinary field of human ambition. The men who had gathered in the theater of Pompey on the Ides of March had believed, with the genuine conviction of people who have talked themselves into something over many long months, that they were performing an act of political surgery, that the removal of one man, one exceptional, dangerous, beloved, tyrannical man, would restore the balance, that the Republic, given the chance, would reconstitute itself. That history worked that way, that you could cut out the part that was wrong and keep everything else intact. Their failure was total in ways they could not have anticipated and would not have lived long enough to fully understand. The surgery did not restore the patient. It created a vacuum, and the vacuum created a war, and the war consumed 1 million lives across 3 continents, and at the end of it, the thing they had died to prevent, the permanent, hereditary, God-sanctioned rule of one man over Rome and everything Rome touched, was more completely realized than it had ever been under Caesar. They had not stopped the empire. They had midwifed it. Their daggers had removed the modest, improvised, still contested autocracy of Julius Caesar and replaced it, through the specific mechanism of their own failure, with the systematic, legally enshrined, divinely endorsed autocracy of Augustus. He built the city of marble that Caesar had only begun to imagine. He constructed the legal and administrative architecture that would hold the Roman world together for centuries. He did all of it on a foundation of proscription lists and executions, and the systematic hunting of every man who had raised a blade against the ghost he carried through 14 years of war. He weaponized that ghost more effectively than Caesar had ever managed to wield himself. He built an empire out of the momentum of a funeral and called it the Age of Peace. The list was finished, every name collected, every debt paid. The era of debate was over. The era of the sword had produced its emperor, and the emperor had decided, with characteristic efficiency, that what came next would be called the Pax Romana, as if the silence that follows the elimination of every possible source of dissent is the same thing as peace. This is how empires are actually built. Not in the Senate, not in the speeches, not in the philosophy, in the lists, in the patience, in the willingness to wait as long as it takes for the last name to be crossed off. If you've made it to the end of this, you already know you're in the right place. Subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who can handle the unvarnished version of history. You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. The next video is already on your screen. Click it. The descent continues.